Hello, my name is David Turner and this is another Lunar Poetry Short, and today I'm joined by SA Smythe. Hello SA.
Hello.
As always, we're going to start with a reading.
Alright, thank you. This one's called Languish. All of our language crowned, pull joyous, an anchor back in from being dropped through the heavy dark, and the blinding thud of sickening contact, with axles spinning through the now muddy lawns as the bells outside sound helplessly. We slept before we made our way inside, the night and wildflowers, watching, she wept before we made our way upstairs, began breaking a window by opening it. Now there's a chorus that repeats itself, and our kneecaps cannot listen since we're too busy wanting to learn over and over and over again how to solve loneliness, how to become thieves filling rucksacks on rooftops. I watched the mystery of the same weddings of science and myth, of the Greeks and of whiteness. Did I build a boat out of berries and birch branches, try to row it up a mountain instead of just changing the boat? I waited for the sea to rise and for the rock to liken itself to an island, waited for the earth to library its boulders in a languid city. I walked with my arms out, picking bricks off the corners, swallowing things without names that do not care if they make my stomach hurt, as I sit in this bedroom, as I dress like a ghost, and dance to the sound of the swords marking the trees with their sharpness. The apples, the trees, they keel in the house that broke over the back porch. We kept walking, trying to talk, kept making squeaks when trying to undo the most done deeds. I sometimes do not know how to end things.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello again.
Hello
Thank you for
again.
coming down to Elephant Road in
Pleasure to
South East
be
London. Yeah. First question is always, why poetry?
Why poetry? Yeah, I think a lot about it because I'm primarily an academic, I think, although my friends have been telling me to consider myself as much of a poet as I want to consider myself. But words have always been really important to me. And as you saw in that poem there, language is also a really considerable part, not just who I am as a person, an academic, a poet, or all these labels, but sort of coming to consciousness and reconciling myself with my family. I have a lot of different languages going on in my family, and so trying to really access, in a way, beyond, even though it's in English, sort of accessing ways around and between that has been really important for me. And there's something about poetry. I love novels. I began reading at a really early age, but something about how poetry is like the way to break those rules, break the norms as long as you know them, that's been really important to me.
I think in terms of language, poetry seems to work pretty... there are obviously some things which don't translate from language to language, but poetry works in a way that is more about a way of speaking, isn't it, rather than the words themselves. And languages are much more about how we communicate rather than just, there are cultural elements to all languages and ways of describing things anyway. So I don't think it's interesting when people... So do you work much in different languages other than English as well?
In terms of my poetry, yes.
Yeah.
But to take a step back and respond to what you said, I think that's interesting to me as well, because actually most of my poetry has been written. I've written a lot of things that I'm only recently trying to get up the courage to share out loud. Recently in London, I've been doing a lot of open mics, and I've been asked to do performances in Manchester, Berlin, and here in London. But yeah, I think what you're saying is right. Like the spoken word is something separate almost than poetry. Like it makes me feel a little bit closer to what I've actually been trying to accomplish in the written word. But yeah, I do write in other languages.
Yeah, because I've been lucky enough to see spoken word events in other countries. I used to live in Scandinavia, so I saw a lot going on. Even though I speak Norwegian, but you don't miss out on as much as you perhaps expect by not understanding the language. If a poem is delivered well, there's still a lot of emotion involved. And
yeah, I think about the embodiment is really important, but also there are, and I have a friend of mine, and we're trying to create a chapbook, but with her visual work and my written, and it's really helping me think sort of hypertextually, like the words and what they look like on the page and what they're really trying to convey. So giving the words their embodiment without my voice, but wholly with my voice, if that makes sense. Like different ways to sort of embody the words that I've been trying to grapple with and the ideas. But spoken word, I used to live in New York City, and spoken word, there's a place called the Sidewalk Cafe, and that's where you have, I mean, Regina Spektor came up there before she became Regina Spektor. A lot of people who are musicians, but they think embodiment and the way they do their phrasing of their lyrics in really interesting ways. And that's where I learned about, I mean, from far back as hip-hop culture and the beginnings of that, the ways that spoken word is now, like that common, I don't know how to describe it, but you know, that spoken word phrasing that people do. I mean, that's really based in like one guy from the late 70s. And so I'm really interested in, I don't do it when I read, as you've heard, but I really am interested in other ways to sort of recite and really get around that, that common phrasing. Basically, I'm really interested in the textuality of it, which is kind of anathema to the spoken bit, but yeah, I don't know if that answers.
No, there's definitely, I agree, I think there's definitely a spoken word language as well. There's definitely a way of speaking
exactly. It sort of takes on its own language again. Like it goes, everything we do, we try really hard to, like it's the words that we're speaking, it's the embodiment that we're doing, but then it goes back to language. We can't really escape it. So I like to think and write about sort of that inevitability.
I think we'll talk about language a bit more in a moment, but what outside of language, what have been the other influences over your writing?
Like I started to say, family is definitely one of those things, and also vulnerability, which sounds really cliche. As the word came out of my mouth, I just cringed at it. For the listener, I'm cringing, but I present a sort of masculine of centre. Gender is kind of a thing that, well, you know, oppresses all of us, but also I think a lot about in terms of my scholarship and in terms of my creative and just living. And there's something to be said about pushing that while still being comfortable. I'm not sure that makes sense, but really there's something about masculinity and not butch, but butch identity and these kinds of tropes that are bound to maleness that are really interesting to me, and I really want to shatter them. And I really like and I'm not linking, you know, femininity to softness, masculinity to hardness, but there's something that I really like within myself about the softness, and I often see that in my scholarship, but the way that I dress and carry myself in the world, I'm not afforded that. And something about poetry lets me just stand up and be soft. Even in my writing, I get to really sort through for myself and then get to share with others the fact that I am damaged is a really harsh word, but you know, like I've experienced things that have wounded me, and I can either let them sort of take advantage, or I can really grapple with that and sort through them for myself and for my community, etc. And one of those things would be the loss of my father and the fraught relationship that we've had. Ever since that, I've experienced like a really strong or craving desire to keep writing and to write about that, and then eventually get to the place where I can see that beyond myself. You know, like, it's not just about me and this particular loss, it's really loss of, again, language, loss of a sense of innocence and wholeness that can be afforded to us, and that is not just in a nuclear sense, but also in terms of diaspora. I'm not the only black person of colour, queer person who has travelled, either emotionally or been forced to move or have been wrenched from a sense of comfort and stability, and so that's a real inspiration.
I think there's definitely a lot to revisit, but we'll take another reading for the moment,
sure,
if you don't mind.
Okay, and this one is called Rictus. Perché il silenzio arruggisce? Perché il terrore che conoscevo era la tua faccia dietro un vetro. Non ricevo gratitudine per essere una porta di legno inudibile. Avresti potuto dire di lasciare una pistola con proiettili nel mio nome. Sotto la piccola apparenza di enigmi, non si è mai dimenticato di tacere mentre strisciano attorno alle nostre teste come mosche. Perdonami il bianco, è stato o la sete per la tua bocca o l'ombra di una memoria. Non posso dire. Il mio addio cenerio laverà tuoi piedi con lavanda, con albicocche, con ciniglie ora leggermente roteate come vermi che contorcevano attraverso terriccio liberato. E con tutto il mio peso notto e le lame delle mie unghie ingoiate, ho scelto di dimenticare la mia vecchia bestia di battistrada e di direzione. Per questo è andato avanti, prosegue ancora e non finirà.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now I do believe that was Italian.
It sure was, David.
Yeah, I'm glad you told me it was Italian beforehand. I think I picked up enough of that. But maybe it would. Maybe there isn't a need for a question, but maybe you could just explain why you chose to read that particular poem today and how language, and in particular Italian, informs your life and your work.
Mm-hmm. I picked it. It's my favourite sounding one. So I actually just scrolled beyond the one that I intended to read when coming in here based on our conversation. And I really like it. So I'm going to have to translate it, which a little bit defeats my purpose, but there's a portion in the poem that is hypervisual. You'll see it. There's definitely a space between not just one stanza and the next, but the words themselves are scattered in one stanza on the page, and then in the next stanza I sort of apologise for that space, and I think a lot about apologies, and blankness in a way. So that gap, or the aporia, is a word that I think it's like this Greek highfalutin word, basically meaning like this thing that cannot be sort of articulated, and so there's a double irony there in that Italian is not my first language, or my second, and so the apology can be one based in identity, but also one based in trying to reach or get closer to bridging that gap with silence.
So is there an element of guilt towards the silence? So I find sometimes that, especially with people that start writing and then getting up and speaking as well as spoken word, there then is an element of guilt culturally in the scene, I think, of staying silent about certain subjects. I suppose people that write about identity, in terms of people of colour, queer, genderqueer, do you think there's an element of guilt for then any periods of silence and reflection and not continuing to talk about things? Or is there pressure outwardly to keep talking about these things?
That's a really good question. I've been thinking about that a lot. I almost used some profanity, didn't know if that was allowed on the podcast.
No, it's fine.
Quite a bit, David.
Yeah.
But because, I've been in London for a year after moving from California, and you enter different communities and you see sort of different politics at play or not at play, and learn to get in where you fit in, or resist where that's necessary. But what's been really interesting, there's a whole thing which is not for this podcast about like how Facebook and social media presence sort of plays into that. But there's been short answer, I think you're right, and I think that's a little bit toxic when people are not generous with themselves, and so it's like a self-apology, but also with community, whatever fraught thing that means, where they feel like, okay, I'm coming to terms with my consciousness as a queer person, as you're already black, but coming to terms with black consciousness and any kind of radical or leftist or deeper form of that label throughout sort of history of various communities. And then it's not ironic, but it's almost a double-edged sword. The more that you get conscious, the more that you feel like you have to take on sort of a more leftist or radical persona. which actually defeats the purpose. Like, you're supposed to become more liberated in yourself and how you identify, etc., etc. But that sometimes makes you feel... You also know, for example, that you are one person, you don't represent an entire monolith, right? That's the first thing they teach us in Black Radicalism 101. We are not a monolith. I represent multitudes of XYZ thing. And yet, sometimes I see you express an opinion, and then like the radical community will like jump on and say, whoa, this is not conscious in these ways, you're forgetting these and these people, you're not doing these things right. And it becomes a bit of an attack, like you're not falling into line of another monolith, as it were. And so the apologies sort of come from all sides, and I'm guilty of it from both ends, and I really wish... the apology is a little bit different in terms of what I was just writing about, but it does link up in terms of, you know, how and who we're apologising for. And I really... It's not a thing that I know how to articulate, but I really wish we could make manifest a liberation that doesn't require apologies, and also enables generosity. Like, I can be able to make a mistake and not feel guilty if I'm experiencing something as an individual, while recognizing I'm a part of something greater. I should still be able to sort of slip up and get to my own journey, not on behalf of anyone else, you know.
I think also, and this goes for all creatives, you know, doesn't matter about gender or sexuality or any of these issues, but the more you get pigeonholed by other people, and because this doesn't relate to how you view yourself, it's always the boxes you're putting by other people, the less you're allowed any form of escapism through your writing, you know. And I think this has only come from conversations with other people who we haven't spoken about this between us, but I think there's a lot of guilt for some writers that they want to just write something that is pure escapism sometimes, and then there's a guilt that's involved. But I might be going off on a bit of a tangent.
No, I don't think so.
But I think it perhaps comes back to when you talked earlier about recognising elements of softness in yourself and not wanting to link them to feminine traits in any way. But this, I suppose, all comes back to what languages we're allowed to use in other people's eyes, not within ourselves. And I suppose that then just takes us all back round to this original theme of what language you're told you can use, and through the course of your own writing, being able to find, you know.
Yeah, if I can go and take another stab at that first question, why poetry? It's because identity politics is a trap, and I want to be able to articulate that as many times as possible, maybe by that very sentence, but also, and I didn't, just to be clear, I was saying I didn't want to link femininity to softness, but I'm super happy with being ascribed any kind of feminine anything. Like the term masculine absenta is something I picked up in the US. It's not even used as much in the UK as far as when people pick it up, it's clear that they've had encounters with the US. If I could just be like, if there's this phrase, "Can I live?" and if I could just do that, David, that would be really great. But it's really impossible, and that sense of guilt is really, really toxic, and I'm trying for myself not to feel it. So it is language that's described about other people, but then I'm also I'm an anxious person. I'm hyper critical, and so what I do is I try to preempt people either reading my work or gender's a presentation, it's performative, reading my performance, and I try to take that a step and then try to subvert it before they even get to make an opinion. But then who, quote unquote, you are really gets lost, and then you find yourself, sort of just swallowed up by that.
And sort of assumes a lot of knowledge and attention by the audience, doesn't it?
Yes, it sure does.
Because if they're not listening...
it doesn't even matter.
It doesn't.
They take what they take anyway. They're still going to be reading you the way that they want. That's absolutely true.
Yeah, so I think there's still more to talk about, but before we go on, we'll take a third and final reading, please, SA.
That sounds great. Okay. This one's called "The Truth Is." The truth is, if a screaming cat is an agonized child, then the neighbour scraping autumn from her lawn could be a woman, combing her hair so hard that hanks and clumps are ripping loose. He's coming for you. By each noise in the room against yours, a filament crackling, furniture scraped on the floor, the sigh of a vent at odd hours, or a kettle on heat. It's a throat held half closed. If the animals are his too, the stray crossing your hearth, the birds filling your head, the moths immolated in your lamps. It doesn't matter if he's coming for you. He already has.
Thank you very much. So I believe at the moment you are a visiting fellow at the University of London.
Yes.
So maybe we could talk about a bit like what you're up to at the moment and how that informs your writing.
Yeah, so I'm affiliated with the Institute of Modern Languages Research at University of London. It's a joint affiliation with the Centres for Cultural Memory and of Contemporary Women's Writing. So it's my PhD, which is on the history of consciousness in California. It's on Italian East African women's writing, so women and also gender non-conforming people who identify themselves as Italian but have East African origin. And it's considering really, these are like hyper academic terms, but things like ontology and epistemology, so the state of being and the form of knowledge, formation of knowledge that's based in blackness. And really that links with Italian colonialism, thinking through politics of migration in the Mediterranean, what I use to bridge those things is sort of the aesthetics of queerness and diaspora. And what I hope my projects are on in the future is really just shedding light on the writings that come about that are based on writings of migration, specifically from East Africa into Italy, and internal migration in Southern Europe. Really invested in thinking through blackness and black identity that is not sort of rooted in any sort of empirical way. So what we think we understand about blackness, even what we think we understand about Black Europe, has been overshadowed by, first of all, Anglophone culture. There's English, French, German colonialism, and we think that sort of the whole story. And Italy, what I work on specifically, gets like a minor rap within that. And so working in that has been really interesting personally, but also politically, thinking about politics of citizenship and identity and belonging, things that I've recently realised I'm obsessed with in my own personal narrative, but are really important on this sort of broad scale, because Italy's got its own goings on with citizenship struggles at the moment. So it's not only that. It's not just thinking about citizenship and second generation identity in Italy, but really thinking through what it means to be black. Like, how does the ontology or being black change when we consider the Mediterranean as a site of that? The Mediterranean is a very mixed place. Southern Europe, Italy included, is a very syncretic place. It's a place that includes like different kinds of ethnicities, cultures, musicalities, identities. It's a very diasporic place in and of itself. So if we really think, instead of saying there are a lot of black people coming, what we read on the cover of all the newspapers now, people coming into Europe, but really thinking blackness already embedded in these places, what does that really mean for us to be black? So these writers that I'm really invested in, so, when I say writers, it's really broad. They're poets, they're hip-hop artists, they're musicians, filmmakers, just creative writers, don't and also cannot do that in places like Italy, where it's, ostensibly not just Christian, but hyper-Catholic. I mean, that's where the Pope lives, basically. It's like Catholic foundation, but also has this, I almost want to say without migration, but, with what we know now to be Italy, there are anxieties already between the South and the North. Those are definitely related to race, ethnicity, and other kinds of belonging. And in fact, Italian colonialism, in a way, just exacerbates the anxieties that were already present. They basically cemented what it meant for Italy to become a white nation. And that's why I'm interested in it. It's not, you know, in England where you have, ostensibly there was this, like, this sort of white nation that its empire went out. In some sense, Italy's imperial forays happened internal to itself. You know, southern Italy was an Arab nation, it was an Arab empire, rather. And it definitely had all these, I keep using the words syncretism, but these like amalgamation, these like this group of like mixing and mashups that really need to be explored more. So I'm really interested in that, and it really also feeds into my obsession with language, because the language of colonialism, I'm gonna get so much flack because the word that's coming to my mind is beautiful, but I mean it in like, you know how awesome and initially meant like full of awe and awful, yes, and negative. Yeah. I don't mean like colonialism bad, right? That is like the number one thing I want to make sure. Identity politics is a trap, colonialism bad, as long as those things are clear. But the way that these writers, most of whom are women, there are a few queer writers that I study, and also writing collectives that have different ethnic, age, national identities that write as one. I'm really interested in the beauty of that, in the aftermath, as it were, of colonialism. The way that they can say, here are the pieces that you've left us. Your violence, one of the writers, Gabriele Germandi, says that, you know, it stops with me. Like, the buck of colonialism stops here, I'm writing back. And the way that they're able to sort of resist the trend, but still taking on the identity, the national identity of Italian, is really impressive to me. And this is coming from someone, you know, my father's first language was Spanish, and he would not teach me Spanish. My mum literally begged him. I begged him eventually when, you know, people at my school were learning their, you know, French and learning German. I was like, could I just get in on this other language? Because I have to learn it at school anyway. It's not a negative thing. But I learned from a very early age the hierarchies of language and identity, and to be able to write about how these women and people sort of take that burden, release, like liberate themselves from that burden, sort of write back from a place of beautiful resistance, is really, it's impressive, and I'm glad to do that work.
I think we're going to have to wrap. I hate cutting these things off because we could talk for a lot longer about this. Yeah. Hopefully we can talk again. Just to wrap up, if people want to check out your work, is there any way they can follow you in terms of finding out where you're going to be reading? Or
Yes, indeed. I have a Twitter which I'm working on being more active on. It's SA Smythe, ESSAY SMYTHE, Twitter. Also WordPress, and Gmail.
Yeah,
I'm happy to sort of do any readings. You can just write to me at those sites.
I'll put links in the description box for this video. Thank you very much, SA.
Thank you so much.
Really interesting.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah.